Well, good morning, Grace. Who'd have thought you'd be hearing so much about tasty food this morning, right? But often, hey, when you notice those, if you see a repeat, that might mean something, right? Where we're going to see in this story that it actually has a whole lot to do with our stories in Genesis, doesn't it? Problems that started all the way at the beginning, dealing with our God being our stomach, right? But, we're continuing on in this theme of blessing through Genesis. Where we've been taking a few weeks, and this whole year we're looking through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and just taking a thematic look and seeing what is God doing in and through His people to establish what He's going to do in and through all of time. And last week we examined Abraham's life and how blessings, we said, were performative, right? Biblical blessings are never meant to merely be possessed, but shared. What we've been given in our relationship with God should always lead to an outflow of blessing towards others. But also when we try to grasp for it, right, in our own timing, in our own way, the blessing that God set out for us in His time will bring curse upon ourselves and others around us. And unfortunately, cursing is just as much performative as blessing can be, right? Well, this week we're going to take a look at a man's life who kind of, in his life, you see both sides of the issue very clearly. We're going to look at Abraham's grandson, Jacob. I often joke when I talk to people about Genesis, reading Genesis is often like watching Jerry Springer, is it not? I mean, really, like if you just, this story we've got right going on here that Cindy just read, Jacob and his family are the epitome of what that show is all about. And this is just one small glimpse into it. They're basically a family that is in turmoil at all times. And, the central conflict in Jacob's story, it arises from the struggle that he has to believe in God's ability and willingness to fulfill the blessing that He promised to him before he was even born. And as a result, Jacob spends his whole life harming those around him. Instead of trusting God, he resorts to schemes and attempts to steal the blessing and abundance for himself. And kind of a recap of where we've been a little bit in Genesis. In Genesis we see in the beginning, right, the story that we see God is the producer of life. And what He gives to humans in blessing is the ability to reproduce, to be fruitful, to multiply, fill the earth. This is part of the blessing He bestows on all of humanity, right? And by the time we get to Abraham in chapter 12, when he comes along, God's saying to him, I will bless you, and through you I will bless all of the nations of the earth. See, Abraham receives blessing, and that received blessing that he has will go out to bring performative blessing in others. Because the reality is those who want to follow after Yahweh, those who want to follow after Jesus, will always take their blessing and turn it into life-giving abundance for others. But the question is, what would it mean to bless your friend who's blessing you, right? Who is the blessing? Well, it's simply you bless them back, right? Creating this economy of generosity, back and forth. Suddenly, in this kind of kingdom mentality, this blessing mentality, there's enough. I can share with you, you can share with me, right? But there's going to be times where I don't have enough, but what? You've got my back for it, right? And there will be other times where you don't have enough, but ideally, I'm going to have your back for it, right? I'll bless those who bless you, and you will be a blessing. And I think, honestly, we all know this type of person. We all know this type of person. We've met them, right? These types of people, it's the person that life is abundant when you're around them, right? There's just more joy. There's more optimism when they're around. And some people are just so generous that it becomes contagious. Have you ever met that person? That when they give, it just seems like it just over in abundance and it just giving starts happening back and forth. They are a blessing that brings blessing to others and it in turn goes out. And I think that's the nature of God's blessing. That's what it looks like as we begin to do this. But when humans try to manipulate God's blessing and seize it by their own means, we've been looking at that, they bring about a curse instead. And what we do time and time again, humanity, we hurt each other in pursuit of what God has called death, thinking that it's going to produce life. And I think the story of Genesis is an easy place to see this pattern throughout, over and over in the patriarchs. This family does not deserve to be blessing keepers, do they? I mean, you don't watch Jerry Springer and go, these are the people that I want to model my life after, right? You are the father, right? No, we don't want that. That actually happens. I mean, almost like you are the father over and over. I'm serious. It's like they were just taking these stories from here and putting it into a script. These people don't deserve the blessing. For example, when Abraham fails to trust God's promise for a son, what is he and Sarah what? They choose to abuse their servant Hagar. Abraham has a child with Hagar. And then when she has a son, right, they're eventually sent away because Sarah, his wife, receives a son, Isaac. The one who's going to make her laugh. Now when somebody else laughs, she's like, get out of here, right? And instead of acting like God's chosen one and blessing other people, Abraham brings a curse upon her and her family. And then you see his son Isaac even repeats his father's sins exactly by lying about his wife to another guy named Abimelech. The same name, same sin following after him, right? Bringing a curse almost upon those he lies to. And there's this story, God's chosen ones over and over and over are just as much a conduit of cursing as frequently as they are conduits of blessing. And so the question goes, why in the world does God continue to give responsibility to people that seem unworthy of the trust? You ever read Genesis and go, really? These are the people you chose, God? Really? I mean, Abraham's bad. You know, he occasionally acts like the snake from the Garden of Eden. But man, I tell you what, Abraham's grandson, he doesn't just occasionally act like a snake. It seems like he's born from the womb, coming out of the womb, a treacherous snake. Lying all the time. And what if it is like his lying is the language from the womb? That's exactly what Jacob's story is all about. And so we're going to see in his story today, we'll see a life that Yahweh wants to bless, wants to bring blessing to him. And if Jacob would just simply wait upon Yahweh, he'd gain everything that's promised to him. Yet, Jacob cannot stop grasping and inciting curses upon himself and his family over and over and over. So what I want to do today, I'm going to jump into his story. We're going to cover a lot of ground. We're going to do it very quickly. So I'm going to kind of look at three main stories, four really, but three kind of main stories in this life. But kind of where jump us to this place where these guys, Jacob and his brother, are born. You know, if you follow the story of Abraham and Sarah, right, it's the son of promise, Isaac. He marries a woman whose name is Rivkah, or Rebecca, and her name, interestingly, means just kind of like a tender calf. She's a blessing, somebody that would bring blessing, right? And God bestows the same responsibility of blessing upon Isaac that he did Abraham. And when it comes time for Isaac to have children, remember when Abraham, it was told he's going to have children, what did he do? Anybody remember? What did Abraham do when he was told he was going to have children? Did he wait upon God? No, he did not, right? And he did anything but wait upon God. Thankfully, at least one place where it goes pretty well, Isaac, when he's to have children, his wife's barren, just like his mother was, but Isaac prays. Chapter 25, it says that when his wife was barren, he prayed, and his wife, Rebecca, became pregnant. God answers by giving her children. And I want to pick up this story in chapter 25, if you would with me, chapter 25, verses 22 and 23. So after she becomes pregnant, and you see already when they're still in still in pregnancy, these two are going to start fighting from the very beginning. Anybody have the siblings that do that, right? Nobody's kids ever did this. Well, these two are doing it before they're even born. You know there's trouble. But it says, but the children struggled with inside her. And she said, why is this happening to me? It's like she knew something's not right. So she asked the Lord. Good place to start. Just ask Yahweh what's going on. And Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from within you. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Jacob and his twin brother Esau, what are they doing? They're wrestling with each other even from inside the womb. Before the birth of their sons, God promises Rebekah that the second-born son will rule over the firstborn son. It's not how it's supposed to go, right? The younger Jacob will receive the blessing that the older typically would get. So God's saying it right here, this is what should happen. Jacob's the son God chooses. And it kind of directly goes against the ancient Near Eastern thought. Who typically gets what comes from the father that's passed down? The firstborn, right? They get the double blessing. They get a lot of these things. Well, and this is a subject that's too big. It's another theme that we're not even going to get into. Take a look sometime walking through Genesis, just in Genesis, of the idea of secondborn. How many times the secondborn is the one who receives? God doesn't always go the way we think he will. The theme, pick up in verse 24. So it's been promised that Jacob, the secondborn, will be over the older. And it says, when it came time for Rebekah to give birth, there were twins in her womb. The first came out reddish all over like a hairy garment. It's like, I mean, you imagine this guy's that hairy from birth. I mean, it just is amazing. And so they named him Esau because he was so hairy. But when his brother came out with his hand clutching Esau's heel, you talk about some weird stuff going on. Like out comes Esau, and here's Jacob holding on as the baby's holding on, coming right out after him. Right? He's clutching Esau's heel, and they named him Yaakov is his name. And Isaac was 6 years old when they were born. What this means is basically he came out grasping the heel, and they named him heel grasper or heel grabber. I mean, it's like, well, there's a hairy one, and there's one that's grabbing the heels. Imagine, kids, if that's how your parents named you, right? Here's misshapen head, and here's long and skinny. I don't know. I mean... But man, this name for Jacob, the Yaakov, is absolutely fitting for his character. It's a picture of tripping somebody. Often it's used in Hebrew of tripping somebody. You're going to grab their heel, and if you do that when they're walking by, you trip them up, right? So Jacob's consistently attempts, and throughout this, he's going to usurp his brother's position from the very beginning. All the way from the very beginning, he doesn't want to, he's almost like, you're not coming out first, I am, but Esau just beats him, but he's going to grab on while he's going. He's not going to let him come out on his own. He's going to show up in some miraculous way to go, oh, what about this one? We're going to show him, right? Even from birth, he's going to live up to his name time and again. He's been promised, remember, before birth, that he'll be a conduit of the blessing. But will Jacob trust and wait on Yahweh? That's the question. Will he trust and wait on Yahweh? Fat chance. And so I want to look at 3 stories in Jacob's life that show how he is. The first story is the very next thing of when we read. So after it goes and says the boys grew up, Esau became a skilled hunter and a man of the open fields, but Jacob was an even-tempered man living in the tents. Look at this. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for fresh game. There's that tastiness, right? I mean, think about it. He grows up and he loves his son because of what he can what? Provide for him. But what? Rebekah loved Jacob. And you already see something going on in this family. And so right after this, look at this. The first story about the brothers is the very next verse. Jacob is going to manipulate and steal his brother's birthright, or his, I'm going to use the Hebrew, and it's on your notes. If you have your notes with you, look at these later. His Bekorah. He's going to steal his birthright with a bowl of stew. Watch this. Look at 29 through 34. He says, now Jacob cooked some stew, and when Esau came in from the open fields, he was famished. And so what Esau said to Jacob, feed me, la'at, and this is a word that's actually used. Everywhere else is used about feeding an animal, by the way. This is not a good light of who this man, he kind of grows up very animal-like. Watch this. Feed me, he says, like you would an animal, some of that red stuff. Yes, this red stuff. Some of that adom. Like, it's like this brutish guy goes, feed, adom. Like, eat red stuff. I mean, I'm not kidding you. That's what the Hebrew, this guy is so animalistic here, his brother. He's hairy, and he acts like an animal because I'm starving. And he says that's why he's also called Edom. Well, interestingly, if you look at Edom, it's the same 3 letters as the red stuff, Adom. So he says, Edom, I want Adom, which is the same three letters as, anybody want to guess? You probably didn't hear it. Adam, right? Same three letters in Hebrew. Edom, red stuff, this Adom and Adam, all three. Watch for the word plays here. Watch this. But Jacob replied, well, you know what? First tell me your Becherah. Look, said Esau, I'm about to die. What use is my Becherah to me? But Jacob said, all right, well, here. And he pulls out a little contract. Hey, why don't you just sign your name here on the dotted line and swear an oath to me now. And so Esau swore an oath to him and sold his Becherah to Jacob. What has Jacob already done to his brother in the very first verses we see when they grew up? He's already grasped a heel. He's stolen it. He's a heel grabber. And then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew, and Esau ate and drank. He got up and he went out. And so Esau despised his Becherah, his birthright. See, Jacob knows his brother's a brutish, simple man. The text even portrays him as a stupid animal, right? And Esau will sell his birthright, his Becherah, for a bowl of food. I mean, you're not starving that bad, and so what we have a story of Edom, that's his name, whose name is the same letters as Adam, who forfeits his favored position for a portion of food, Adom, that he thinks is more important at the moment. What do we have all over again? Eden all over again. Somebody that's going to forfeit their prized possession and their position for a bite of food, right? I think there's something powerful here in this story about how often humans just exchange God's blessing for a quick fix. Anybody? Anybody ever? None of us ever done that, right? Well, it doesn't stop there. Next, we're going to arrive at a story Cindy read for us in chapter 27. I'm not going to hit all this, but you've got Jacob and Rebekah. They're going to scheme together to steal Esau's, not his Becherah. He already did that. Now he's going to steal his Berakah. He's going to steal his firstborn's blessing. And he's going to do it with what? Some tasty food, right? Some more meal. More food. Watch this. Look at, so he's going to, I guess we'll read in a second. But along the way, Isaac, who knows what Yahweh has said about the two sons, what's he trying to do? He's blind, by the way. He wants to give the blessing to who? Esau, the firstborn, even though God had already told him that it's to go to Jacob. So Isaac is going to try to grasp for blessing the wrong son. Why? Because Isaac likes Esau's tasty food. He sees it and it's desirable to him, and he will attempt to grasp at it instead of doing what Yahweh has called him to do. You starting to see a pattern here? Right, it's interesting. If you note, the word eat or ate shows up 8 times just in this one story. And tasty shows up 6 times. In other words, it's desirable food. He sees it and it's desirable. And interestingly, who cooks the food for him this time? The one who is the tender calf, Rebekah. Remember that one story a couple back with Abraham when he made the food for the 3 men? It was Tov and Ravak. Well, this is not going to be Tov. It's going to be Ravka who's going to be doing it. She should be the tender one that makes the tasty food for her husband in the right way, but she's going to use her blessing to be a curse to her husband. And so you're going to see in this story a picture of all 4 family members trying to outdo one another by bringing cursing on others instead of waiting upon Yahweh to bring blessing. And so the story goes, we just read it, but Isaac wants to bless Esau, right? His favored son against Yahweh's wishes, and his wife Rebekah, who loves Jacob more, wants her favored son to have it more. And so what does Rebekah do? She spits the serpentine wisdom to her son to deceive his father and get the blessing. And note what happens in verses 12 and 13. Look at this in 12 and 13 of 27. Man, this is scary here. This is like Lady Macbeth. Ashley said this to me right before. She said, he said, he's like, because Jacob's worried, right? Because he's a smooth man. He doesn't have hair, and this guy is so hairy that they'll put goat skin on him, and it fools his father. I mean, it's just amazing how hairy this man is. But he says, my father may touch me, and he'll think I'm mocking him, say, and I'll bring a curse on myself instead of a blessing. But look what Rebekah says. So his mother told him, any curse against you will fall on me, my son. Just obey me. Go and get them for me. Rebekah says, may the curse fall on me. You go get in there and do it. And if you notice in the story, after Jacob deceives Isaac with Rebekah, we never hear about Rebekah again after this story. She disappears from the story. She is the only patriarch or matriarch in all of Genesis. We don't hear about her death. We don't hear about her burial. She never gets to see her son Jacob again after this day. May the curse fall on me indeed. Watch the words that we say, right? What she thought was good in her eyes brings not blessing but death, as well as separation from her beloved son Jacob. And so what Jacob does, remember, he goes and he gets dressed up in Esau's clothes. He puts on goat skin because, yes, Esau is that hairy. And Rebekah makes him a stew. And Jacob succeeds in catching his father's heel and steals the blessing or the barakah from him. Note verses 28 and 29. Whenever he does fool him finally, this is what he says to him. He says, Isaac says, may God give you the dew of the sky and the richness of the earth and plenty of grain and new wine. May people serve you and nations bow down to you. You will be Lord over your brothers, and the sons of your mother will bow down to you. This sound familiar? May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. That's the Abrahamic covenant, right? Just like him. But ironically, the blessing Jacob steals is what? Jacob goes through all of this to steal the blessing when the reality is what? If he had just... It was already his. It was already his. And here he is trying to steal it from him. It was his all along. God said, it's yours. And Jacob's either unaware of what God said about him or he just can't believe it. And so he spends his energy trying to scheme and seize the very thing God promised him. Why? Because he does not trust God. And I love what Esau says about Jacob in verse 36. Esau exclaimed after he figured out what's going on, he says, Esau exclaimed, Yaakov is the right name for him. Heel catcher's the right name for him because he has Yaakeved me. He's tripped me up twice. He took away my Becherah, and now look, he's taken away my Barakah. You see the play on words here? Jacob's so good, he's not going to leave anything behind. He's going to be the schemer to the very end. Again and again, Jacob acts just like the snake from Genesis 3, over and over. But what's interesting, everybody in this story is doing the wrong thing in this story, right? But what happens? Everybody's doing the wrong thing, but what happens? The right thing happens, right? The right thing happens. It turns out exactly how God said it would. The right thing's happening, but everybody has the wrong reasons for doing what they're doing. Kind of like what Joseph says at the end of Exodus. Y'all meant it for evil, but God is able to plan it for good. And I think, and if you look at the story of Jacob, after this, he enters 20 years of exile. He's out of the land for 20 years because he cannot stop grasping. And he goes to stay with his uncle Laban. If you know the story, Jacob actually meets his match. When it comes to heel catching, he meets his match in his uncle Laban. His uncle Laban may be better at this than he is. And basically, it's 20 years of them back and forth deceiving each other. It's like, who can out-deceive the other one? That's the whole story of he and Laban. But what's interestingly, in those 20 years, what happens to Jacob? His flocks multiply. He ends up with 4 wives. That's a lot. 12 sons and a daughter, right? All evidence, if he's got multiple children, he is what? Interestingly, in all this deceiving, all of this heel catching, he's still going to be what? Blessed. This is the guy who stole the blessing. But we see in his story both his wives to each other, all 4, and his sons, all 12. Well, amongst them, they're all what? They're all rivals. His favored wife is a heel catcher, Rebecca. She gets her own dad, Laban. She lies about stuff. Soon, in a couple chapters, his sons are going to be deceivers against an entire town to use the covenant, the sign of the covenant blessing in order to murder an entire town. Like, this is the family that God's going, yes, these are the people I've chosen to be a blessing to the whole world. Right? And his family is divided and constantly hurts each other. And it all stems from Jacob's failure to trust God. He remains determined to seize God's gifts by force at the expense of others. I think what Jacob's story shows is a picture of blessing surrounded by an environment of curse, grief, toil, abuse, hardship. And I think this contradiction is very true to the human condition, is it not? Sometimes the gifts that come our way are wrapped in challenging, painful circumstances, are they not? And so the question is like, what does God do with a people like Abraham, who occasionally blew it big time, and even more so with Jacob, who's a deceiver from the very start? What does God do with these types of people? Well, what's God going to do with a guy who just won't take the gift? Here's your gift, Jacob. No, I don't want it. I'm going to take it myself. What do you do with that guy? Well, it culminates in a story of God picking a fight with him in the middle of the night. Turn with me to chapter 32 of Genesis. God's going to say, all right, fine. We're going to throw down out in the desert. And it's a great story. We could spend a lot of time here, but I'm going to force myself not to. But what we see in this chapter, Jacob's sleeping by himself. He's at the end of his exile. He's on his way back into the land, finally, and he's preparing to re-encounter his brother Esau, who, remember, at the end wanted to do what? Kill him. It's been 20 years. Esau, so he's wanting to come back, and he stays up all night with his scheme. He's going to kind of line up his wives and his sons and all of his property in from least favorite to most favorite. So the least favorite get to Esau first, just in case he steals them all or kills them. Well, at least he gets his favorites by the end. I mean, this guy is over the top. He never stops. Never stops. And he sends them on. And is told that there's a man that picks a fight with him by the stream in the middle of the night before sunrise. And what is this man going to do? Let's look at verse 24 and 25 in chapter 32. And it's almost like one of these, hey, he's sleeping, and just as one does, right? You start wrestling a man in the middle of the night. Like a man shows up. It is one of those, there would have been some more information. It would have been nice, but that's okay. All right, he sent them across the stream and all his possessions in verse 23. Verse 24. So Jacob was left alone. Then a man wrestled with him until daybreak, like one does. But when the man saw that he could not defeat Jacob, he struck the socket of his hip so that the socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated while he wrestled with him. What does he do? He wrestles with him, and it's kind of like, you know what? I can't win with this guy. And what does he do? He punches Jacob in the groin. I mean, you think about it. How are you going to dislocate a hip going out? He punches Jacob in the groin so hard that it dislocates his hip. But notice, what does Jacob not do? Even in that, he still doesn't let go, does he? He's still grasping on. Why the groin? Well, it's the biological source of his fruitfulness, right? It's his reproductive anatomy. I mean, it's here, okay? That's part of the story. This is your reproductive anatomy. This is the be fruitful, multiply, fill, right? And this is all Jacob has tried to do, is just try to get as much fruitful multiplying as he can, but to do it on his own terms. Look at verse 26. And then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. He hasn't let go of him yet. He says, I will not let you go. Jacob replied, unless you bless me. And then the man asked him, what's your name? And he answered, Yaakov. Well, no longer will your name be Yaakov, the man told him, but Yisrael, because you have Sarak with God and with men and have prevailed. The man tells Jacob, he says, listen, the sun's about to rise. Let me go. Jacob says, No, I'm not letting you go until you give me a blessing. Why do you think Jacob thinks this guy can bless him? Because he knows something's true about this guy, right? The guy says, what's your name? So it's I always have these conversations when I'm wrestling people. He says, my name's Yaakov, right? And the man said, no. Your name is no longer Yaakov. Remember, it means what? Heel grabber. Instead, your name is going to be fights with God. Yisrael. Why? Because he says, you sarad, as the Hebrew, you fought with God and humans. I'm changing your name. And he says to him, he's like, basically, here's the thing. He's like, I have to give it to you, Jacob. You've prevailed. You've done it. You have a way of scheming your way out of any situation and coming out on top. He's kind of saying, I think here, the man's saying, I've met my match with you. It's kind of like in the illustration you ever heard about the immovable object, irresistible force and the immovable object, right? Well, the irresistible force here is God's desire to bless, and the immovable object is, at least in the biblical story, humanity's stupidness, selfishness, and self-autonomy. Which is going to give out first, right? Is it God's will or is it man's responsibility? Which one's going to move? And Jacob wrestles with God for the blessing that was intended for him all along. Look at this. He's wrestling and holding on to a man that's God saying, give me the blessing. When all along, God said what? It's already yours. What a picture of his entire, right here is a picture of this man's entire life in one snapshot. Why? Because Jacob was unwilling to receive God's blessing. And what does God do? He wounds him in the very place where he sought to generate his own blessings. I love what Dr. Alan Ross says it this way. He says, to be successful with God for Jacob meant that he had to be crippled in his own self-sufficiency. To be successful with God meant he had to be crippled in his own self-sufficiency. And so one of his names now will be wrestles with God. And the people of God are going to carry this name with them, right? The people of Yisrael. Well, read the story. What do over and over? They're constantly what? Wrestling with God. But eventually we learn that this man is more than just a man that he's wrestling with. Jacob believes this man is God, the same God who his grandfather called to live in the land. He calls the place Peniel, which means I have seen God face to face. Jacob realizes this man is more than just a man, that he's wrestling with God. And for the rest of his life, Jacob is going to walk with a limp as a reminder of how he's related to God for so long. I think when we look at the theme of blessing and cursing in Genesis, it's kind of, if you had, you ever metal detectors, right? You're going over something on the beach and it's like, boop, boop, you get these little things. Well, if you look at Genesis and this idea of blessing and cursing, well, if you're running your metal detector over, and over chapters 1 through 3, you get a few of them, like boop, boop, right? There's a few. There's not much until you get to Genesis 12, and you kind of hit 1 through 3, it's like boop. And then it kind of disappears for a lot. But man, when you hit Jacob's story, it's like you hit a treasure trove. It's like boop, 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 boop. I mean, it's everywhere. Like this idea of blessing and cursing is all over the place in his story. Jacob's story is filled with ideas of blessing and cursing, and it exemplifies in his entire life. And if you look at the end, he ends his days kind of a bitter old man. He's a tragic character, honestly, in the story of Genesis. He's a tragic character, but he's God's tragic character. And God makes him a vehicle for the chosen seed, and that's what the story of his sons are going to be all about. And so in this story, you have Abraham chosen by God to give the blessing. And Abraham's a mixed bag, right? There's many encounters with God, but also many snake-like moments. And you kind of go, if it's God's will to attach his mission to bless the world through this mixed bag, Abraham, what does it look like for the nations and for him? And then 2 generations later, you get the story of Jacob, whose life is characterized by deceit, but God has attached his plan to bless the world through him. What does God do with a guy like this? Well, he wrestles him and he wounds him. but he does not abandon him. God is working hard to bring blessing to his people, but Jacob is a perfect example, I think, of what we constantly do. We try to grasp for the blessings for ourselves. And in the process, we end up cursing ourselves and cursing others when we do it. Because we just can't simply wait. I think Jacob's story conveys a clear message. God never abandons his chosen ones, even those who are less than righteous. But sometimes he may need to wound us a little bit to remind us to wait for him, right? I want to kind of close here. I think it's a reminder for us today. The Jacob story is quite a clear reminder for us today. We serve a God who has blessed us with every heavenly blessing in Christ Jesus if we trust him and follow him as our King, right? And God's desire in Christ is to bring us blessing and not cursing, just as he did for Abraham and his family. But he wants us to eat from the tree of life. From finding those blessings in his son, Jesus. And I think we must discover that blessing sometimes is in obedience to what Jesus has called us to. And obedience often means waiting. Waiting for the blessing to come when he desires. It means not grasping for blessing, not grasping for the fruit of the other tree that only brings cursing. I want you to turn with me real quick to Lamentations chapter 3, one of the clean parts of your Bible, where the pages are still stuck together. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 18 through 26. I just want this to be a reflection for us this week to think about this. I think these are the passage, the truths that are kind of here are things we need to chew on constantly. And remember, when we're reading this, remember what's the situation that Lamentations finds itself in. What are the people of God? Where are they in the midst of this being written? Anybody know? They're in exile, right? The people of God are experiencing a wounding for trying to grasp for themselves. And they're out of the land. And these words come to the people. And look what they say. Verse 18 and 19 is the kind of the mentality that they have. So I said, my endurance has expired. I have lost all hope of deliverance from Yahweh. Anybody ever been there? Remember my impoverished and homeless condition, which is a bitter poison. This is their position. This is how the people truly feel when they're wounded for not obeying. But let's keep reading, verse 20 through 26. I continually think about this, and I am depressed, but I call to mind, therefore I have hope. Yahweh's loyal kindness never ceases. His compassions never end. They are fresh every morning. Your faithfulness is abundant. My portion is Yahweh, and I have said to myself, so I will put my hope in him. Because Yahweh is good to those who trust in him, to the ones who seek him. It is good to wait patiently for deliverance, for Yeshua, deliverance from Yahweh. It's good to wait on Jesus. I think this is to be our position before Jesus. We're to wait upon him for the things promised through his word. I think these things sound very familiar to the Beatitudes that we talked about a few months ago, that we sang about in that last song. Right? We as God's people are called to pray and to seek his face. And when we receive the blessing, we are not to sit on it and hoard it for ourselves, but we are to performatively bring the blessing to others. This is how God's kingdom works. This is the new economy that is in God's kingdom, is that we are to be a people that bless others because we have received every spiritual blessing in Jesus. And then next time we get together, we're going to see the story of Joseph. Actually, in 2 weeks. Javen's preaching next week. But we'll see the story of Joseph, a man who lives out the beauty of waiting upon Yahweh, and the blessing that he brings transforms all of those around him. I can't wait to share the end of the story with you. But for now, let us wait patiently upon Yahweh. Amen. Upon Jesus. Let's pray.